Hello there. For today's tasting, I'd like to share a wine that's something of a passion for me, really. This is Chambers Rosewood Vineyards Rutherglen Muscat. It's a non-vintage wine from a half bottle. And really, my belief that the sweet wines produced from Muscat and from Muscadelle, the topiques, in the Rutherglen region are some wonderfully rich, fabulously complex wines that are among the best value sweet wines that you can get. So Chambers Vineyard is one of the oldest wine producers in Australia, based in Rutherglen in northeast Victoria. The company is currently managed by the 6th generation of the Chambers family, Stephen Chambers, and as well as having a fantastic reputation for making the Muscat and the topique style of sweet fortified wines, they also make a range of red and white table wines that are available both internationally and in some of the small production runs simply in Australia or just from the cellar door even. So the company was established in 1858 by William Chambers, who with his sons Philip and Jabez had left Norfolk in England after having had a disagreement with his employer at the time. Evidently, both William and his sons had spent time studying viticulture in France and had been sponsored for that by this particular employer. And it turns out that they actually ended up putting this education to some really good use here in Rutherglen. William started out by leasing some land from somebody called John Foord. And one of the first things he and his son Philip did was that they planted a hedge of rose bushes right the way around the estate, hence the name Chambers Rosewood. Immediately opposite where they were, there was one of the region's first vignerons, somebody called Anton Rush, who was a Prussian. And it seems that in these early years there was quite a complementary relationship between the Chambers family, who'd learnt about viticulture, and Rush, who had winemaking skills. I think also, reading between the lines, the Chambers family were quite skilled negotiators. And so when in September 1860 gold was discovered in the area and miners made claims on both their property and that of Rush, it was the Chambers family who negotiated access rights with the miners. And they obviously did this quite well, because in 1862 they were able to buy the land they were farming from John Foord. Now, quite a major step in the company's history was when in 1890 Philip Chambers, who was running the company, passed away, followed tragically just a few days later by his wife, who died in childbirth. And that left his eldest son Will, the 3rd generation of the family, to run the company, to take over, aged just 18. But actually it was Will who established a lot of the foundation of the company in terms of him laying down the celerias for some of what are now great old fortified sweet wines. So he put down celerias for both Muscat and for Muscadelle that are used to this day in the production of wines, such as the grand and the rare examples of those wines here at Chambers. And Will obviously had a skill both as a winemaker and as a blender, because throughout the early 20th century the company's wines won many medals on the Australian show circuit, and they gained a very high reputation for their sweet wine and also for a dry, floor-affected style of wine. Things weren't all smooth going, however, because in 1899 Phylloxera arrived in the Rutherglen region, and it was the Chambers family, led by Will, who were one of the first people to institute a solution to the problem, in terms of that they had to grub up all their vines and replace them with vines that were grafted onto American rootstocks that were resistant to the Phylloxera aphid. As a result of this, today Chambers have some of the oldest grafted vines anywhere in Australia, with some of their oldest vineyards exceeding 110 years of age. Also in the early 1900s, Anton Rush decided to return to Germany, and the Chambers family were able to buy his property, and evidently that's where their current winery now stands. Now, Will continued to run the company until he died at the age of 80. His son Arthur, a 4th generation of the family, never really took control of the company, because he died a couple of years later of cancer, leaving his wife Peggy with 7 children. And as a result of this, there was a stage where the wines of Chambers Rosewood weren't actually made here. The family entered into a partnership with somebody called Frank Henman, and the wines were made at another winery called St Leonards. So this sort of hiatus ended in 1959, when another William Chambers, this time the 5th generation, he was better known as Bill, returned from having studied winemaking at Roseworthy Agricultural College in South Australia, and he'd done very well for himself there. He'd won the gold medal as the top of his class, and he'd spent some time working for the Stanley Wine Company while he was away, and thus Bill was well placed to oversee a revitalisation of the company, both in terms of improving the vineyards and also in terms of bringing the stocks of wine, the Celleras, back from the St Leonards winery. Evidently his mother Peggy continued to work in the winery, looking after the bookkeeping and dispatching the orders, and that enabled his wife Catherine to look after the livestock side of the business. They also ran sheep and had a stud for cattle, poles evidently, and that had been Catherine's family business, but they relocated the flocks and the herds from her family home in Benalla. And thus Bill stayed in charge of the company until 2001, when his son Stephen, the 6th generation of the family, took over its running. So just quickly to talk about the quality levels in the sweet wines that are made in Rutherglen. These are all quite clearly defined, both in terms of sugar levels and in terms of the age of the wines that go into these. So you have 4 grades. You have the Rutherglen level, which this is the entry level. You have the Classic, which is sort of an old vine version. And then the next up the scale is the Grand, and then finally the Rare. Each of these sees increasing sugar levels and greater age in the wines included in the blend or the Celera, because both processes can be used to make these wines. The decision of which system, Celera or blending, to use is entirely up to the individual winery. So yes, Rutherglen Muscat such as this is supposed to be what they call a foundation style. It's supposed to be expressing those fresh, raisiny aromas of muscat, clean spirit, length and flavour. And I believe the designation is that this has to be made of wines aged between 3 and 5 years and must have residual sweetness of between 180 grams per litre and 240. Now Chambers claim that they exceed those standards because this contains wines between 3 and 7 years old and has 248 grams per litre of sugar. The vineyards here in Rutherglen sit at the base of the Australian Alps and are flanked by the Murray River. As I say, their oldest vines exceed 110 years in age, and they have somewhere in the region of 30 varieties planted here, including one variety, Goulet, which is very rarely seen and is actually best known for being a parent variety for Chardonnay. Now the Muscat use is a version of Muscat à Petit Grand, not the Muscat Blanc à Petit Grand, but tend to use the Muscat Rouge à Petit Grand here, or something that is often known by the Australians as brown muscat. Now as far as harvest is concerned, excluding a period between 2015 and 2022, this has always been hand-picked. But yes, for those few years they experimented with machine picking. The Muscat is picked at a higher sugar level than you would do for a table wine, so it's picked at about 16 Beaumet, so potentially 16 degrees of alcohol. The grapes are destemmed and there's a resultant must that is actually quite thick and quite gloopy because this is still containing all the skin fragments and the pips, and a percentage of raisins here as the grapes have dried on the vine as they've got to this high level of ripeness. If the health of the fruit is good enough, they will allow fermentation to go on with indigenous yeasts. If not, they'll inoculate. And the juice ferments in a selection of large tanks and wooden barrels, many of which will date back to the company's origins in the 1800s. Now the fruit really only undergoes a partial fermentation. They say they'll ferment 2 to 3 Beaumets worth, so just to a couple of degrees of alcohol. The fermentation evidently releases colour and adds complexity to the wine. Also, interestingly, there's an increase in the sugar levels, and the reason for that is that there are raisins in this concentrated must that get rehydrated and release further sugars into the ferment. So to stop fermentation, a high-strength neutral spirit at about 98% alcohol is added. The use of a neutral spirit allows the beautiful muscat fruit perfume to still show through. Fermentation is up to 16% alcohol in order to prevent any further fermentation, and the wine that results is put into tank where it'll settle, and then it undergoes what's called cross-flow filtration just to get all the skins and the pips and all the bit out of there. Following filtration, the alcohol's increased up to 18%. The wine goes into old casks for aging, and these casks vary in size from about 900 litres up to 5,000 litres. And they will keep wines of individual vintages and from individual vineyards separate as they age. So the process of selecting the blend will involve doing bench trials, taking the different portions, different ages and different vineyards of the Muscat, assembling a blend, tasting that, assembling another blend, comparing that and seeing what combination works best. The selected wines are then blended, filtered and returned to cask until required for sale. What they'll do is they'll bottle the wines on demand, just to ensure that when it arrives with the retailer, aromatics are as pure and as fresh as possible. So let's have a look at the wine and see what we make of it, shall we? Firstly, I want to remark on the colour. I do love the Chambers Rosewood name. It's so evocative, and all of a sudden you've got this lovely reddish brown colour there. I've seen this wine described as amber, and really it's got more of a reddish brown colour than that, but you can see lovely amber at the rim as I'm swirling there. Now the wine is really clinging to the glass there and forming some very, very obvious tears there. So we've got a wine that's probably at least medium bodied and has, as I say, 248 grams per litre of sugar in there. So I'm expecting this will be a very sweet and very rich wine. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas really are beautiful. I mean, again, somehow the Rosewood name is evocative. There seems to be a beautiful sort of rose petal perfume there, perhaps some Turkish delight, but also rich, fresh sultana and raisin notes, perhaps figginess. Because the wine has aged in old oak, there are no obvious notes of cedar or vanilla or anything like that. At the same time, there are some quite high tone notes, maybe candied peel as a result of oxidation and possibly also developing at quite warm temperature, so perhaps a little bit of maderization, a slight rancio character there. So let's have a taste. The wine is very sweet. It's actually only medium to full bodied, so it's not incredibly syrupy, and there is a balance, there's a freshness to it. It's just allowing these lovely floral perfumes to overlay notes of raisins, figs, sultanas, those wonderful rich dried fruit notes. And again, you've got those slightly high-toned notes from oxidation and maderization there, sort of candied orange peel, those sort of aspects. The alcohol is noted as being at 17.5%. They actually say the analysis is 17.8. But it doesn't feel hot and heavy, rather the sweetness keeps that in balance, and there's a freshness that's giving the wine a lovely length. So it finishes with those notes of sultanas, of candied peel, and also of lovely rose petal perfume. The wine's beautifully harmonious. It's not a wine I would lay down in the cellar to keep. It's not a wine that's going to gain anything in terms of complexity. Rather, what you might do is lose the purity of those lovely perfumes. When I looked at the Wine Searcher aggregated critic score for this wine, it scores a 90 out of 100. And while that's a good score, I can't help feeling it's slightly hard done by there. Some of that feeling may be as a result of my personal preferences, but I would argue that this is a wine that has intensity and it has a level of complexity that just takes it to the next level and lifts it to, say, 91 or 92 out of 100. What I'll do is I'll leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this wine, and you can see if it's available near you and at what price. And I think you might find that that's a really great value wine. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button, that would be greatly appreciated. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, do feel free to pass it on to them. If you would like to watch more of these videos, do sign up and subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you do that, also make sure that you set yourself a notification so that you can be alerted every time I publish a new tasting. If you have any comments, please add those in the comments box. I'd love to know what your experience of tasting the wines from Rutherglen is, and what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. So thank you again for joining me, and I do hope you'll manage to make some time and come and join me for another tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.